My name is Cadet First Class Jet Kaler. I am an Air Battle Manager Select and proud member of Air Force RTC Detachment 675. I'm a fourth-year senior at the University of Oklahoma and will receive my degree in Mass Communications. I am honored to introduce this afternoon's keynote speaker, General Herbert Hawk Carlisle. General Carlisle is a U.S. Air Force Academy graduate and earned a master's degree in business administration from the Golden Gate University of San Francisco. His military education included Air Command and Staff College, Armed Forces Staff College, and Army War College. With a military career spanning 39 years, his service included command of 2 operational wings: Air Combat Command at Langley Air Force Base, Virginia, and Command of Pacific Air Forces in Hawaii. He also served in a key staff position as Deputy Chief of Staff of the Air Force for Operations. General Carlisle currently serves as the chair of the board of directors of the Stimson Center. Prior to joining the Stimson Center, General Carlisle was president and CEO of the National Defense Industrial Association. So without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome General Carlisle.
That young man's name is Jet. Isn't that a cool name? Kind of like Hawk, you know, Hawk and Jet. You could make a movie out of that, I think. I'll lower this a little bit so you guys can hear me. So, Gene, thanks for having me. Tomas, as always. It's great having everyone here. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here. Of course, I am the last speaker. So, brilliant people have gone before me and spoken eloquently, so everything's been said. But as the saying goes, it's not that everything has been said, it's that everybody gets a chance to say it. So I only have 102 slides I'll go through to make sure I recover everything that's already been said. I'll try to get us back on track, and at the end of the day, I know that I am the only thing between you and a cocktail, so I will definitely try to keep our pace going here. It's great to be here. It's great to be part of this. I think this endeavor is incredibly important, and I'll kind of talk about it in kind of 3 different phases, and again, I'll try to step through this really quickly. Our nation is in a fight. It's not a competition. People call it competition. I know the term gray zone is used. It's not. It's a fight. We just heard the misinformation fight. I think that's one of the key ones, and great panel, by the way, outstanding. And it's fueled by our adversaries, which we know. I think the saying we used to use was, don't believe anything you read and only half of what you see. I think now it's don't believe anything you read or anything you see. You got to go back and verify it by as many sources as humanly possible. We as a nation are in a fight for influence around the world and leadership of global organizations. And we are in a fight for technology. And that is why this organization is so incredibly important. I think America and the West writ large are slow to wake up to this. We're getting the idea, but it's taken too long, and we're behind the power curve in where we need to be and where we must go. We have got to win the technology fight. I think everybody knows that. So how do we win that technology fight? What do we do? In the past, we own the technological advantage. You just look at our conflicts. If you go from post-World War II to Desert Storm, Iraqi freedom, enduring freedom, air war over Serbia, we've owned a technological advantage. And that time, most of it was created inside the government. I think in a lot of cases, we talked about it, there's a lot of industry that's part of that. But most of it, a lot of it came out of the government. That's not the case today. I think we know that. A lot of it, if not the vast majority, is commercial enterprise. It's UARCs, it's FFRDCs, it's institutions, it's organizations like, I haven't got used to saying this yet, OADI. It sounds funny, doesn't it, OADI? It's a great name. Oklahoma Aerospace and Defense Innovation Institute. It's a great organization, but that's where a lot of this technology is coming out of. We need to understand the dynamic as we go forward, especially today between industry and the government. And the government means DOD, which we've talked a lot about, talked less about Congress, which is a huge player. And then I think increasingly, and less so has been in the past, but increasingly that includes academic institutions. How do we bring organizations like OADI into that? How do we take advantage of that? How do we move it forward in the research and engineering and developing capabilities that we have to have. And it's not just 6-1. It's not just basic research. It's all the way through. And the other part of that I think is critically important is, and it's not just developing the technology. We can all have bright, shiny objects. It's to get it into the hands of the soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines, Guardians, and Coast Guardsmen to make it effective. It doesn't do any good if we talk about it, but we're not feeling it. And that's one of the challenges we face with our adversaries. So you got to understand the difference between the government, how it operates, the industry, defense industry in particular. Now you got to remember that, and Leon Corrett, who is one of my heroes in the world, we had a discussion about this, but you got to understand what it's like dealing with the DoD, right? They're not always a great customer. They can be a bit of a challenge. No, you did not. I did. Because I used to do, it really is. You got to remember, DoD sets the requirements, they set the budget, they can often control the competition by the way they do that, and then industry has to produce what the government needs. It has to fill those requirements. And remember, the government doesn't make anything, really. Industry does. And so we've got to take advantage of that as we move forward. We've got to understand the requirements, and I think that's incumbent upon the military in particular, the uniform operators specifically, to make sure everybody understands what the requirements are. You know, and I can't tell you how many times, and we used to have these days at ACC where we'd just bring industry in and we'd go, okay, you guys just sit there and be quiet. And of course, we could do that. We'd bring them all in and go, sit there and be quiet. We're going to tell you what we need. We're going to talk about our gaps. And then you go off and figure out how to solve those gaps for me, and then individually come back and tell me how you're going to solve my problem, this gap I have, and that's how we'll go forward. That's the incumbent. I don't think we do near enough of that. I think we need to do more and more of that, where the industry that's not, and it's the operators, it's the people, those young women and men that execute the mission every single day. They know the best answers. They know how to solve those problems, and that's what we got to do. It's communication, it's cooperation, it's trust and understanding between industry and the government. And you got to keep this in mind, and I think this is critical. The defense industrial base is a strategic asset for us as a nation. It's a sixth military service for all intents and purposes. It's the best in the world, bar none, and I believe that today. And I believe, again, I'm a glass half full kind of guy, as B.J. Suedo knows, but it is the best in the world. The military controls the requirements. They control the resources. Industry manages the production, the research and development to get to what they want to get to, and then the production. Our advantage in industry is not a God-given right. It's one we have to earn over and over and over again. And today, more than ever, we're seeing it. And I think there's two statements I'll bring out here that are fundamental to the difference between the way defense industry in particular, and as organizations like OADI and academia jumps into this, have to understand this. The difference between the defense industry and commercial industry is General Motors will go out and build a car, and then they hope they can sell it. General Dynamics sells a boat and then tries to figure out how they're going to build it. I mean, that's the way it works. You don't, until you have a program of record, right? We all know what that's like. You don't go out and build a whole bunch of things until you have a program of record, which becomes a problem as you start to develop capabilities and how you do that faster. Commercial firms have millions of customers with requirements that change rather slowly. Defense firms have one customer that has rapidly changing requirements as technology, the world we live in, and the threat that we're going to face goes forward. And there's a natural tension, obviously, between Department of Defense and government spending and industry. The Defense Department, logically, wants to get capabilities to the field as fast as they can with the greatest capability for the least amount of money, right? That makes sense. Most bang for the buck. Industry, they want to fulfill the requirements of the content and what they're looking for, but they got to maximize financial performance and enhance shareholder value. And I think that's a natural tension that some people, certainly people inside the department, often fail to take advantage of, or often fail to fully comprehend Because if the industry is not going to have access to global markets, they're not going to have access to capital, they're not going to be viable companies if they don't increase shareholder value. And if you go back to, there's a great case study of Jack Northrop versus Jack Welch, right? So Jack Northrop worked for Lockheed Martin for years. In 1939, he started his own company and became Northrop Corporation. He was an engineer, he was a technologist. The most challenging technology is the stuff he wanted to work on. If you remember, one of the first things he did was to design a tailless airplane, which eventually became the B-2. Pretty amazing when you think about it. But it was all about the technology. Jack Welch changed that equation, and not him alone, but he was kind of credited with the key change, and that is the idea of shareholder value. That the financial performance of companies, rather than the technological advances, became the driver for shareholder value, which became the driver for industry. And we got to understand that as we go forward, because that natural tension cannot get in the way of cooperation, communication, trust, and understanding between the defense industry and the government that's going to do that. We need industry, we need to help, and this is, I think, where academia can help. We need industry to take the long view. What industry operates on quarterly earnings. Whether you accept that or not, that's a fact of life. They operate on quarterly earnings. And at quarterly earnings, you're either going to say something surprisingly good or surprisingly bad. That's all that happens in quarterly earnings. If it stays exactly what they anticipate, then you don't create shareholder value. So and we got to get industry to take the long view. Academia can help. Organizations like OADI can help because they can drive us to that broader thought. They have a longer view as a general rule. In UARCs and organizations with university-affiliated research corporations, they have the ability to have a longer view, as do the FFRDCs, the federally funded research and development corporations, and the national labs. We heard from them already today. So that's what we need to do to work with when we bring academia as a third leg of the stool. For a long time in our country, it was really industry and government, defense industry and the government when it came to national security. Increasingly, we talked about it before also, economically security and economy, national security is critically important, and it's part of that. And it's not even a whole of government, it's a whole of nation. It's not the Department of Defense, and that's what we got to move forward. You have to understand that the defense market is different, and it's monopolistic. I think that's a proper way. There's one buyer, right? DoD, and again, they're not always a great customer. There's FMS, to some extent, DCS to a lesser extent, but it's really one buyer. There's only a handful of sellers. A consolidation we've seen significantly in the way of qualifications. There's barriers to entry. We talked about it earlier with clearances and things like that that make it increasingly hard to have the facilities to work on things like that. Remember, in the case of DoD, the buyer is the regulator. The buyer is also the auditor, and the buyer sets the requirements in the budget. So you just got to understand that. It is what it is. We all know that we need to change the PPBE system that the Honorable Ms. Lord talked about. It's a great concept. It's a 60s era McNamara system that does not work in today's system. She said there's good things about it. I've yet to see them. Nothing personal. But it's got to change. But it's not going to change overnight. So until it does, we've got to understand the difference between the defense industry and how it works. But NDIA, that I used to be the president and CEO of, has done the last 3 years done a report called Vital Signs that looks at the defense industrial base and examines exactly what's going on, where it's going. And it's startling and upsetting in that the defense industrial base is rapidly shrinking and losing because people are bailing out of it because it's so difficult in many cases. And the new entrants have diminished year over year for the past 3 years. Since 2016, actually. We went all the way back to 2012 with all the data we could get. So that's got to be a factor. And when you think about it, it's how much does the defense industry really move the needle? We talked about it with microchips, right? 2% of the microchips are purchased by DoD. So our ability to affect the microchip market is 2%, which is not much. And this is a dated slide here, but Walmart 5 years ago had about $500 billion in sales. $500 billion in 1 year in sales in Walmart. The top 5 defense industries put together, $230 billion. So we're not moving the needle, but we've got to understand that it's the national security and where we go from there. So I'll kind of shift. I think an education and understanding of what the defense industrial base looks like, what DoD looks like, and then the one that we haven't talked about, which I think is a whole nother full day, is Congress, right? I did 3.5 years on the Hill as legislative liaison for the Air Force. They're great Americans. They're trying to do the right thing, but it's 535 board of directors votes that they can never agree. And it just becomes a challenge. And, you know, even things like retiring old aircraft so that you can generate new aircraft, that's hard to sell in Congress. It's very hard to sell. I have more scar tissue from A-10s than you can imagine. I mean, my back is bloodied because of that, and it's understandable. Again, it's understandable. The great Americans trying to do the right thing for their communities, their districts, their states, but it's a broader view on how you move forward. It was talked about briefly, but I'll just go over a few seconds, and then I'll close with what I think is a threat, and I think it's something that we need to more and more educate American people on. The things that we need to work on going forward, and Mark Lewis wrote, he talked about them a little bit, and Schaaf talked about them as well, the priorities for the Department of Defense, but it's actually broader across the whole Department of Defense going forward. But to put them a little bit, instead of just the technology priorities of R&E and the Department of Defense, but to kind of put them in a broader operational perspective. Resilient, effective, capable space capabilities. We're late to the game. We're the best in space by an order of magnitude. Our adversaries are catching up rapidly. Remember 2007, the ASAT launch? It took us 9 years to say space warfighting. You couldn't, in the United States Air Force, you could not say the word space warfighting until 2016. And our adversaries had already shot down a satellite with an ASAT. So we've got to get after, you know, Jay Raymond and I, great friend, great American, the Curtis LeMay of the Space Force. I call him that. He doesn't like it. But we've got to get a resilient, capable, effective space architecture and space order battle. We have to understand and compete in the cyber domain. My good friend Brijay Shwedo and again, tremendous panel. I truly believe that decisive battles in the future will occur in space and cyber. That is what's going to happen, especially in peer competition against who we're facing as we go forward. So how do we understand, compete, and win in that environment? And BJ's taught me many, many things. I pay really close attention to him when him and I got to work together. And, you know, it's the famous quote, if you cyber protect everything, you cyber protect nothing. They will get there. They're already there. How do you deal with it? And I think that's the compete and win in the cyber domain as you move forward. What JET is going to become, JADC2, and what that looks like going forward in the future. What is Joint All-Domain Command and Control? How do we bring Project Convergence, Project Overmatch, Advanced Battle Management System, ABMS, together? Lieutenant General Eric Wesley retired from the Army. Myself and Admiral Scott Swift retired from the Navy are working with DARPA on JADC2 and where we go forward with this. And it's really decision advantage. How do you get after decision advantage? And we kind of coined this term. It's from data to battlefield effect. And how do you get, that's what JADC2 is, right? It's all data, whether it's imagery data, whether it's, F2T2, the entire world, to something on target, a kinetic and non-kinetic effect, whatever it is, you get data and a bunch of it, and you got to make sense of it, and then you got to create an effect on the battlefield. And JADC2 is how you get from one to the next. How do you F2T2 at scale across all domains simultaneously and through domains, right? That's find, fix, track, and target. We in the Air Force were very confident to always say, in Afghanistan, Iraq, little tiny place, we could put 65 Reaper caps up and we had an unblinking eye. That was a famous quote, right? We'd always say, I have an unblinking eye. I can see everything on the ground all the time. Not quite true. We missed it by about that much. But that's what we're talking about, especially when you take an Iraq and Afghanistan and you go South China Sea, Taiwan Straits, North China Sea. You look at across what we would have to do in that, and that changes the fight. Manned-unmanned teaming was talked about that a little bit going forward. It's capacity is part of that manned-unmanned teaming, autonomy, semi-autonomy, and where it's going to go forward. Long-range fires and family of systems was talked about. How do you do that? Hypersonics is a piece of that. F2T2 at scale across domains is part of that. And then weapons and capability, whether it's an air-to-air fight and a missile that can reach out and touch them before they can touch us, or it's a hypersonic weapon surface-to-surface. The Army's working very hard on their long-range fires and where it's going forward, and that's a key as we go forward. And then finally, sustainment. How do you do agile combat employment? You look at the Pacific and what they're trying to do out there. The Marines call it EBO, Expeditionary Base Operations. How do we do that and move forward as we go forward? So last thing before I get to questions, I'm trying hard to get us back on schedule. And I am a fighter pilot weapons school grad, so I talk really fast. So if I'm talking too fast, tell me to slow down and I will. The Chinese Communist Party is a threat. And it's a calculating, patient, with clear and unambiguous goals of changing the world order and international norms to make them the dominant military and economic power. They are the threat. We as a nation have been slow to realize that. And they're working hard. They believe they were wrong during what they call the century of humiliation, the 20th century. And they are striving to impose their will and the will of an autocracy, which you hear Xi Jinping talk all the time. Autocracy is ascending and democracy is in the decline. And they're going to impose that will on the rest of the world. And just think that would look like. And these are things, a lot of my career was in the Pacific, so I spent a lot of time studying and thinking about these guys. Today, less than 7% of the population, 96 million out of 1.5 billion, are members of the Communist Party, the CCP. They control everything. To get into the Communist Party, it's about a 2 to 3 year process. You have a social score. Your family has a social score. You have your education, your economics, where you live, who you don't know, what your social media platform looks like. And a vast majority are never part, like I said, 7% of the population is actually members of the Communist Party. And that dictates every single thing that goes on inside of that country. The most powerful position Xi Jinping has is that he is the General Secretary of the Chinese Communist Party. He's also the head of the Central Military Commission, which is his second most powerful job. He's the president, which really doesn't have any power. It's really the General Secretary of the CCP and the head of the Central Military Commission. And they've clearly stated what they want to do and what they're intent upon accomplishing. They're going to replace the U.S. economically, militarily, and influence, and make other countries surrender to their imagined authority. They talk about it all the time. I think I am probably the only geek in the room that read Xi Jinping's 2-hour speech to the Party Congress earlier this week. I did, and it was long and repetitive. But what he did, he doubled down on what he promised. We will replace the United States across the board. We're going to accelerate our military modernization, and we will take Taiwan by force if required. It's there. He talks about it. And the point being is we as a nation have been slow to wake up to this. If you think about what they've done over the past 25 years, now, when I was still in uniform, I got many opportunities to go to China on official visits. And I actually got to meet with General Ma, who at the time was the head of the PLA Air Force. And he sat down and he looked at me, and it was very candid. He said, "We watched what the Americans did in Desert Storm, air war over Serbia, Iraq, and Afghanistan. And we knew we had to change. We could not compete with you and what you did in that 10 to 12 year period if we stayed the way we were. So what did they do for the next 25 years? They studied us intently. They knew what our strengths are. They studied our strengths. They did everything in their power to counter them. They did everything they could to take whatever. Why did the ASAT go off in 2007? Our space capabilities were a decided asset, a superiority that they couldn't live with, so they had to prove that they could take it down. And that's where the ASAT came from. So for the past 25 years, they've stolen our technology. They've stolen our intellectual property. They've done wolf diplomacy across the world. They've tried to gain influence. They've tried to gain capability. and leadership in international organizations so they can set the standards and change the norms that we face today. And that challenge is now. It's not in the future. Their stated goals are today. Indo-PACOM, Admiral Lung Aquilina will tell you 2027 to 2030. Some people say it's a little bit farther to the right, but any way you look at it, doesn't matter, it's today. And we have got to win with innovation and technology. And that's why what Gene and Tomas and what Owadi is doing is so critically important. We, the Americans, have to be able, and our friends, partners, and allies, have to play an away game in their backyard against a numerically superior threat. And the only way that we'll be able to defeat that threat is if we are technologically and innovation advanced and ahead of them. Now, most folks know there are, and we've talked about this a little bit throughout the day, that there are advantages to an autocracy and what they're doing in moving fast. Their ability to move fast. The government owns everything or anything they want for all intents and purposes. They can dictate what industry does. They can dictate what academia does. They can set profit. They can set prices. There are no budget battles in China, and there's no such thing as a continuing resolution in China. And so those attributes allow the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, to develop and field capabilities very rapidly. But I go back to I'm a glasses half full kind of guy. We have significant advantages as well. Just like, Dr. Lewis said, we have friends, partners, and allies. And our ability to work collaboratively, NTIB was one that Ms. Lord brought up. She brought up AUKUS. The things that really make China mad are Quad, Japan, US, India, and Australia. That really made the Chinese mad. The most recent NATO and EU reinforcement of the US's position vis-a-vis China, that really made China mad. We have friends, partners, and allies. And if we work collaboratively to develop these capabilities, we will have a significant greater numbers just because we work collaboratively. And I'm a real believer in the whole's greater than the sum of the parts. And when we work with the Australians and the Brits and the Canadians, it really does change the game for us going forward. And the last thing I'll say is, now I know this is going to sound corny, but I'll say it anyway, and that is, I truly believe that the innovative spirit born inside of the hearts of free people makes a difference. I think we incentivize thinking that way. Our academic institutions, our people, our government incentivize people to think outside the box. You can be whatever you want. I mean, I grew up way lower into the economic spectrum. My dad was a truck driver. And somehow, I think it's a misspelling, but I got to be a 4-star general in the United States Air Force. Most of my friends didn't believe I made captain, so I've exceeded their wildest expectations. But that's the point. There is an ability in our country to do anything that you set your mind to. And that allows us to have an innovative spirit, to have the ability to think of different, totally separate ways to solve problems. And that's what's going to be the winner against China as we move forward. So folks, again, it was great to be here. I truly appreciate it. Gene, thank you again very much. Dr. Diaz de la Rubia, thank you, sir, as always. It's an honor to be here. This is a great organization. I think it has great future potential. I really do. I believe that the three-legged stool of government, industry, and academia, if we bring them together properly with the right capability to move forward, we will definitely make a difference to the world going forward. So thank you all very much. I appreciate it, and I think I got us close to back on time. Sorry if I talk too fast. Knowing that you're me away from a cocktail. So think hard about your question.
Thank you, General. That was both scary but also inspirational at the same time.
Thanks, sir.
What a great way to close the symposium. Can't thank you enough.
Thanks, sir.
I have a question for you. You mentioned the Taiwan Straits. You mentioned hypersonics. You mentioned some dates out in the future. What worries me tremendously, and we talk about this a lot today, is the speed of translating innovation into warfighter capability. Are we going to be in time?
So, so glasses half full. I'm an optimist kind of guy. Yeah, if we continue to do what we're doing, one of the in my study of the Chinese Communist Party is they are very calculating. If they can turn it into a math equation, that's what they'll do. They love to calculate. If we can change that calculus, we can deter them. And I think the advances that we're making in the different fronts, hypersonics is one of them. I think JADC2, I think that's another one. I think space. I think if you look at what we've done with Space Command and Space Force and what Jim Dickinson and Jay Raymond are doing, their belief in their space capabilities versus ours, that's a calculus that they have a hard time with. I think the other part of it is, and this probably really makes Xi Jinping hate Putin, is that the coalition, the way the West and the free world came together in support of Ukraine, given what Russia's doing, I think that changes their calculus too. Because I think for a long time, when I was there, I think they kind of felt like a lot of countries would, stiff arm, accept a little bit of pain in order to not aggravate the Chinese Communist Party. I think they've seen that's potentially going to change. And I think the interdependency, and the difference between the Soviet Union now is we have an adversary, a peer competitor that is economically as strong as we are, for all intents and purposes. Not quite, but that's close. But if you put Europe, Japan, the United States, Australia, then they don't have a chance. So I think that's the kind of calculus that will continue to change them. And I'll say this, anybody that wears a uniform in here, the United States military is the best military in the world, bar none. We have the best people. And there's not a country in the world that can build an NCO corps, the leadership, the kind of people we have wearing the uniform. There's not another nation in the world that can do what we do. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. I appreciate it. It was great being here, and it's a great organization. Thank you very much.